Imagine a soldier. He is 22 years old. He enlisted in 1914 in the first weeks of the war, when the recruiting offices were full and the crowds outside were cheering. He went through training, crossed the Channel, and marched into the trenches of the Western Front. He has survived artillery barrages that lasted for days. He has gone over the top and watched the men beside him fall. He has lived for months in mud and cold and the constant proximity of death. And then, one morning, he simply stops. He cannot speak. His hands shake uncontrollably. His legs will not carry him forward. He stares at nothing. He flinches at sounds that nobody else can hear. He weeps without knowing why. There is no visible wound, no bullet hole, no shrapnel scar, no blood. The army doctors who examine him cannot find anything physically wrong, but something has broken inside this man, something that the medicine of 1914 has no language to describe and no real treatment to offer. The year is 1915. A British Army doctor named Charles Myers is about to write a paper for the medical journal The Lancet. In it, he will introduce a term that will come to define one of the most devastating and least understood injuries of the entire war. He will call it shell shock. And by the end of the war, over 80,000 British soldiers alone will have been diagnosed with it. That number is almost certainly a fraction of the real total. What you are about to hear covers the full story. How the industrial warfare of 1914 to 1918 broke the human mind in ways that no previous war had done on this scale. The doctors who tried to understand what they were seeing, and the ones who refused to believe it was real. The soldiers who were accused of cowardice and shot. The ones who were subjected to treatments that caused more harm than the condition itself. The handful of physicians at a place called Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland who actually tried to listen to the men they were treating. The poets who came out of that hospital and turned their trauma into literature that is still read today. And the question that runs through all of it. The question that military institutions refused to answer honestly for decades after the war. Was shell shock a wound, or was it weakness? The answer, and the cost of getting it wrong, is what this documentary is about. Welcome to Never Came Home, the channel that tells the First World War through the eyes of the men who fought it. To understand shell shock, you first have to understand what the Western Front actually was, not as a military operation, but as a human experience. Previous wars had been terrible. Men had always suffered in combat. Fear, grief, and the aftermath of violence were not new to soldiers. But the First World War was different in kind, not just in scale. The Western Front stretched 450 miles from the English Channel to Switzerland, a continuous line of trenches, dugouts, and fortified positions. The men who lived in those trenches did not move, often for months at a time. There was no advance, no retreat, no change of scene. Just the same few hundred yards of mud, wire, and death, day after day. And above it all, relentless, day and night for years, the artillery. The guns of the First World War were unlike anything that had existed before. A heavy artillery piece in 1916 could fire a shell weighing nearly a ton over a distance of 10 miles. The barrages that preceded major offensives lasted for days. Before the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, the British fired over 1.5 million shells in the week before the infantry went over the top. A man in a trench during a heavy barrage was not simply frightened. He was subjected to an experience that the human nervous system was not designed to withstand. The concussive force of a nearby shell explosion did not just shake the ground, it compressed the air around the body. It sent shockwaves through tissue. Some doctors in 1914 and 1915 believed, and this was the origin of the term, that the physical force of the explosion was literally damaging the brain, rupturing microscopic blood vessels, causing a form of neurological injury that explained the symptoms, the tremors, the paralysis, the mutism, the blindness. This theory was, in part, wrong, or at least incomplete, because soldiers who had never been near an explosion were showing the same symptoms. Men who had spent weeks under relentless artillery fire without a shell landing close enough to cause physical concussion. Men who had watched their friends die. Men who had carried bodies. Men who had gone over the top and come back and gone over the top again. Something else was happening. Something that the medicine of 1915 barely had the vocabulary to discuss. The British Army's medical establishment in 1914 was not prepared for what it encountered. Military medicine was focused on physical wounds, bullets, shrapnel, gas, infection. The idea that a man could be rendered completely non-functional by an invisible psychological injury was not part of the institutional framework. The Army's initial response to shell shock was shaped by two competing, and in many ways mutually contradictory, impulses. The first was denial. Many senior officers and medical officers simply did not believe that shell shock was a real condition. They believed it was cowardice, that men who claimed to be unable to fight were simply refusing to fight, and that if they were allowed to present themselves as casualties, every man who wanted to avoid the trenches would develop a sudden case of trembling hands. The second was fear of what acceptance would mean. If shell shock was a legitimate wound, if the Army formally acknowledged that psychological injury was as real and as disabling as a bullet wound, the implications for military discipline were terrifying. How could you court-martial a man for cowardice when his condition might be a medical diagnosis? The result was an institutional response that was, in many cases, actively harmful. Men who showed signs of shell shock were frequently accused of malingering. They were told to pull themselves together. They were returned to the front before any recovery had taken place, sometimes within days of complete psychological breakdown. And in the most extreme cases, the cases that still caused the most controversy a century later, they were shot. Private Harry Farr of the West Yorkshire Regiment had served on the Western Front since 1914. He had been hospitalized multiple times with nervous collapse. In 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, he refused to return to the front line. He was court-martialed for cowardice. He was shot at dawn on October 18, 1916. He was 25 years old. His widow spent decades petitioning the British government for a posthumous pardon. It was finally granted in 2006, 90 years after his execution. Harry Farr was not a coward. He was a man whose mind had been broken by 2 years of industrial warfare, who received no effective treatment, and who was killed by the institution that had broken him. He was not alone. Over 300 British soldiers were executed for cowardice or desertion during the First World War. An unknown but significant number of them were almost certainly suffering from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. By 1916, the scale of shell shock as a medical problem could no longer be ignored. The numbers were too large. By mid-1916, shell shock cases accounted for roughly 40% of casualties in some British combat zones. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with men who had no visible wounds but could not function. The symptoms were diverse and often bewildering to doctors trained in conventional medicine. Some men lost the ability to speak entirely. Mutism, complete functional silence, was one of the most common presentations. Men who had been perfectly articulate before the breakdown simply stopped producing words. Others developed paralysis, arms, legs, or entire body, with no corresponding physical injury. Neurological examination found nothing wrong with the muscles or nerves. The paralysis was real. The men could not walk, but its origin was not in the body. Blindness and deafness with no organic cause, uncontrollable tremors, the inability to stop shaking, violent nightmares, the inability to sleep at all, extreme startle responses. A man who had been in the trenches might throw himself to the ground at the sound of a door slamming months after leaving the front, reliving. This is the symptom that modern psychiatry recognizes as the core of what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder, the involuntary, intrusive re-experiencing of traumatic events. Veterans would describe being suddenly, completely transported back to the moment of the trauma. not remembering it, but experiencing it again with the same physical and emotional intensity in the middle of an ordinary day. Private Bert Payne of the Middlesex Regiment was treated at a London hospital in 1917. A nurse recorded his words during one of his episodes. He is back in the trench. He is describing the barrage as though it is happening now, not a year ago. He is crouching behind his bed as though it is a parapet. He is calling names of men who died at the Somme. He cannot hear us speaking to him. He is entirely elsewhere. The psychological literature being generated by the war was, for its time, extraordinary. Doctors were encountering conditions that had no real precedent in their training. Not because combat trauma had never existed before, but because it had never been generated at this industrial scale, with this many men, for this many years. The treatments developed for shell shock during the First World War ranged from genuinely compassionate and effective to cruel, degrading, and in some cases, torturous. At the harsher end of the spectrum was the approach favored by Louis Yelland, a Canadian neurologist working in London. Yelland believed that shell shock was essentially a failure of will, that the symptoms were habits that the patient had allowed to develop, which could be reversed by sufficient physical incentive. His primary treatment for mutism was the application of electric shocks to the throat. The patient would be placed in a darkened room. Yelland would apply an electrode to the throat and deliver electrical shocks, not once, but repeatedly, for sessions that lasted hours if necessary, until the patient produced speech. He recorded these sessions with evident clinical satisfaction. One account describes a patient being told, "You will not leave this room until you are speaking as well as you ever did." The patient eventually spoke. Whether this represented genuine recovery or simply the production of speech under conditions of extreme duress, whether the underlying condition had been treated at all, Yelland considered irrelevant. Yelland was not a sadist in the conventional sense. He genuinely believed he was helping his patients. That may be the most disturbing thing about him. At the other end of the spectrum was the approach developing at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, Scotland, and particularly in the work of one doctor named William Hulse Rivers. Rivers was an anthropologist and neurologist who had spent years studying different cultures' approaches to the human mind before the war. He came to shell shock with a framework that was, by the standards of 1916 British military medicine, radical. He believed his patients. He sat with them. He listened to their accounts of what they had experienced. He did not dismiss their symptoms as weakness or their stories as exaggeration. He understood, drawing on the early work of Sigmund Freud, which was still largely unknown in Britain, that the traumatic experiences needed to be brought into consciousness and processed, not suppressed. His approach was, in essence, the beginning of what we would now recognize as trauma therapy. And at Craiglockhart, under Rivers' care, he treated two patients who would become among the most celebrated poets of the 20th century. Siegfried Sassoon arrived at Craiglockhart in July 1917. He had not been sent there because he had shell shock. He had been sent there because he had done something the British Army found far more alarming than a breakdown. He had published a statement, read into the official parliamentary record, declaring that the war was being deliberately prolonged by politicians and generals who could end it, but chose not to. He called it a war of aggression. He said the men in the trenches deserved better than what they were getting. The army could have court-martialed him. Instead, because he was a decorated officer with a military cross, and because a public trial would have been an embarrassment, they declared him to be suffering from shell shock and sent him to Craiglockhart. Sassoon did not believe he had shell shock. He was wrong. Under Rivers' care, through weeks of conversations, of examination, of being listened to, Sassoon began to produce the poems that would define his reputation. Bitter, savage poems about the gap between the experience of the men in the trenches and the comfortable patriotism of the people at home. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. The other patient was Wilfred Owen. Owen arrived at Craiglockhart in June 1917, referred after a breakdown that had left him confused, shaking, and experiencing vivid flashbacks. He had lain for days in a shell crater next to the scattered remains of a fellow officer. He had been blown into the air by a shell and lost consciousness. He was 24 years old and already recognizably broken. At Craiglockhart, Owen met Sassoon. Sassoon read Owen's drafts and pushed him, challenged him, told him that what he was writing mattered. Owen wrote Dulce et decorum est at Craiglockhart. He wrote Anthem for Doomed Youth. He also wrote to his mother describing what shell shock actually felt like from the inside. I nearly broke down and let myself go at the last moment. I was living with the images. They were not memories. They were present. Every night, the same faces, the same sounds, the same smell. I was not remembering the war. I was still in it. Owen returned to the front in 1918. He was killed in action on November 4, 1 week before the armistice. The telegram informing his mother of his death arrived on November 11, 1918, the day the war ended, as the church bells in his street were ringing to celebrate peace. Shell shock was not a British phenomenon. Every army in the First World War experienced the psychological collapse of its soldiers. The Germans called it Kriegsneurose, war neurosis. The French called it Obusight, shell sickness. The names were different. The symptoms were identical. The German military medical establishment initially took an approach even harsher than the British, heavily influenced by the view that psychiatric symptoms were a form of malingering that could be reversed by sufficiently unpleasant treatment. German psychiatrist Max Nohn developed what he called hypnosis therapy, the use of hypnotic suggestion to command patients to recover. Under hypnosis, men who could not walk would be told to walk. Men who could not speak would be told to speak. Some did. The theatrical quality of these recoveries led some observers, including Nohn himself, initially, to believe that this proved the symptoms had been purely volitional, a choice the patient was making. Later understanding recognized something more complicated, that suggestion and expectation could, in some cases, temporarily override the symptom without addressing its underlying cause. The men recovered their speech. They did not recover from the trauma that had caused the mutism. They were sent back to the front, and frequently broke again. The German approach hardened as the war continued and as the military began to fear that shell shock claims were being used to avoid service. Electric shock treatments, called Kaufmann therapy in Germany, after the psychiatrist Fritz Kaufmann who developed them, became widespread. Kaufmann's method involved the application of strong, painful electrical currents to affected limbs, with the explicit statement to the patient that the pain would continue until normal function returned. The men returned to function, and they went back to the war that had broken them. A German soldier treated with Kaufmann's method in 1917, whose name was recorded only as F.K. in the medical literature, later wrote, "The doctor told me I was cured. My hand had stopped shaking. But at night I could not sleep, and the sounds in my head did not stop." He had treated the outside of the wound. Nobody treated the inside. The fundamental debate over shell shock, whether it was a legitimate wound or a failure of character, was not resolved during the war. It was argued in hospitals, in courts martial, in parliamentary debates, and in the letters of officers to their families. It was an argument that carried enormous moral and practical weight. If shell shock was a wound, a real injury caused by the conditions of industrial warfare, then the men who suffered from it were casualties, entitled to treatment, pension, and the same respect given to a man with a missing limb. If it was weakness, a failure of the individual to maintain control under stress that other men withstood, then treating it as a wound was an insult to every man who had endured the same conditions without breaking. The argument was used repeatedly and cynically by military and political authorities who understood perfectly well that accepting shell shock as a legitimate category of injury would have enormous financial and institutional implications. Pensions, compensation, medical care, acknowledgement of institutional responsibility. General Sir Aylmer Haldane, commanding the British Third Corps, wrote in a private letter in 1917, "If we begin to accept that a man's nerves can be his excuse for leaving his post, we will have no army left inside a year. The trenches are terrible for everyone. Most men endure, some do not. Calling it a medical condition does not change what it is." This view was not universal among commanders. Some officers, particularly those who had served in the trenches themselves, understood what they were seeing. Captain J.C. Dunn, medical officer with the Royal Welch Fusiliers and one of the most acute observers of the war, wrote, "The men who break are not the weakest men. They are often the men who have endured the longest, who have been in it since 1914, who have survived everything and finally reached the point where survival itself is no longer possible. Calling that cowardice is a lie. It is a comfortable lie, told by people who have not been where these men have been." The argument between Haldane's view and Dunn's view was not settled in 1918. In some quarters, it is still not settled today. The official figures for shell shock casualties during the First World War are, almost certainly, severe undercounts. In Britain alone, over 80,000 men were officially diagnosed with shell shock. Approximately 200,000 men were admitted to British military hospitals for psychiatric conditions during the war. These numbers do not include men who were treated at the front and returned to duty without being officially recorded. They do not include men who showed symptoms but were never seen by a doctor. They do not include men who self-medicated with alcohol and were recorded as disciplinary problems rather than casualties. They do not include the tens of thousands who returned home at the end of the war, functionally broken, and simply tried to continue their lives. The American Expeditionary Forces, which entered the war in 1917, were initially better prepared. They had observed the British and French experience and attempted to develop a more systematic approach to psychiatric casualties. In practice, the American military medical establishment was also not prepared for the scale of what it encountered. By the armistice, approximately 159,000 American soldiers had been diagnosed with neuropsychiatric conditions. The real number, by any serious estimate, was higher. Corporal James Hopper of the 77th Division wrote to his sister from France in September 1918, "There is a man in our unit who has not slept properly in 4 months. He does not shake, he does not refuse orders, he functions. But there is nothing left behind his eyes. He is performing the motions of a soldier, and there is nobody inside doing the performing. I don't know what to call what he has. I don't think the doctors know either." The man Hopper described was never diagnosed. He was never recorded. He does not appear in any official count. He is one of millions. The end of the war did not end shell shock. It continued. In hospitals, in homes, in the streets, men who had come back from France, from Gallipoli, from Mesopotamia, from Palestine, men who had survived the war, were not, in any meaningful sense, recovered. They were unemployed or unemployable. They drank. They could not sleep. They could not maintain relationships. They flinched. They woke screaming. They sat in silence for hours. They were using the language that would not exist for another 60 years, living with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the British government, faced with the financial and social reality of hundreds of thousands of men in this condition, needed to decide what to do. In 1922, the British War Office convened a formal committee of inquiry into shell shock. The committee's report, published in 1922, was a significant, if belated, step toward acknowledging the reality of psychological injury in war. It concluded that shell shock was a genuine condition. It recommended that the term shell shock itself be abolished on the grounds that it implied a single, specific cause, artillery concussion, when in fact the condition had multiple causes and multiple presentations. It recommended better training for military medical personnel in future conflicts. It did not recommend pardons for the soldiers who had been shot for cowardice. It did not provide comprehensive treatment or pension reform for the hundreds of thousands of veterans still living with the condition. Dr. Frederick Mott, one of the leading neurologists who testified before the committee and who had spent years studying shell shock cases, wrote in his summary of evidence, "We have seen, across the course of this war, the systematic destruction of the human nervous system on a scale that has no precedent in the history of medicine. The men who carry these injuries home are not weak men. They are injured men. That this distinction was not made during the war, and that men were punished and executed for symptoms that were, in fact, wounds. This is a failure that medicine and the military must both acknowledge. The institutional record of shell shock is incomplete. The medical records are partial. The court-martial documents are, in some cases, still restricted. The pension files tell the story in the dry language of bureaucracy. But there is another record, more complete in some ways than any official document. The poets of the First World War left behind a body of work that is, in large part, a direct record of psychological trauma. Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, Edward Thomas, Ivor Gurney. Gurney is perhaps the most extreme case. He served on the Western Front as an infantryman and as a stretcher-bearer, was wounded and gassed, and returned home in 1918. He spent much of the rest of his life in mental institutions. He continued to write poetry and music, but was never fully functional as a civilian again. He wrote, in one of his later poems, a description of what the war had left inside him that no medical report ever equaled. "There is no rest for this mind that carries the weight of those years. The guns do not stop in the night, though it's 10 years since I heard them." He died in a mental institution in 1937. He had been there, more or less continuously, for 15 years. Rosenberg was killed in 1918. Thomas was killed in 1917. Owen was killed 1 week before the armistice. Of the major poets of the First World War, very few survived intact. The ones who survived physically were often broken in ways that the word intact cannot honestly apply to. What they left behind is not just literature. It is evidence. It is the documentation of what industrial warfare does to the human mind when the human mind has no defense against it and no language to describe what is happening to it. The lessons of shell shock were not fully learned after the First World War. In the Second World War, psychological casualties again overwhelmed military medical systems that were again largely unprepared. The condition was called battle fatigue or combat exhaustion, new names for the same reality. The treatment was, in many respects, better. The American military, in particular, made significant advances in forward psychiatric treatment, treating men as close to the front as possible, with the expectation of recovery and return to duty. Outcomes improved. But the fundamental refusal to acknowledge psychological injury as equivalent to physical injury, the institutional resistance to the idea that the mind could be wounded by war in the same way the body could, persisted. In Vietnam, the same pattern repeated. Men returned home with symptoms that were, symptom for symptom, what Charles Myers had described in 1915. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the intrusive memories, the emotional numbing, the inability to function in civilian life. The American medical and military establishment initially responded with the same mixture of skepticism and dismissal. It was not until 1980, 65 years after Charles Myers first used the term shell shock, that post-traumatic stress disorder was formally included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That inclusion was achieved in large part because Vietnam veterans and their advocates fought for it, for official recognition that what they were experiencing was real, was a wound, and deserved treatment. American Vietnam veteran Tim O'Brien, in his book about the war, wrote something that applies equally to the men of 1915, A thing may happen and be a total lie, another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth. The war was the truth. The damage was the truth. Everything else was commentary. The damage was the truth. It took medicine 65 years to officially agree. The men who survived the First World War with shell shock did not, for the most part, receive the treatment they needed. In Britain, a network of shell shock hospitals and pension boards was established in the 1920s. The system was inadequate, too few facilities, too little funding, and a persistent undercurrent of institutional skepticism that had not entirely disappeared even after the War Office report. Men were assessed. Pensions were awarded or denied. Denial was common. Medical boards were required to determine whether a man's condition was the result of his service or the result of pre-existing weakness, which was, functionally, the same argument about character versus casualty that had been running since 1915. Many men received no pension and no treatment. They went home. They tried to work. Many could not maintain steady employment. The hypervigilance, the inability to concentrate, the sudden dissociative episodes, the nightmares, made steady work very difficult. Their families tried to understand what had happened to them. Many could not. The divorce rate among shell shock veterans was significantly higher than the general population. The suicide rate was higher. The alcoholism rate was substantially higher. Private Arthur Hubbard, who had served on the Western Front from 1914 to 1918 and was discharged with a partial shell shock pension, wrote in his diary in 1923, "5 years since the war ended. I am 31 years old. Some mornings I wake up and I am still in the trench, not dreaming. Awake and still there. My wife does not understand. How could she? I cannot explain it. I try not to talk about it. I drink more than I should. I think about the men who did not come back, and I wonder sometimes whether they were the lucky ones. I do not say that to anyone. I write it here because there is nowhere else to put it." Arthur Hubbard's diary was discovered by his grandchildren in the 1990s in a box in an attic. He had never shown it to anyone. The Battle of Gallipoli, the Battle of the Somme, Passchendaele, Verdun, Ypres. We remember these battles by their names, their dates, their casualty figures. The psychological casualties of the First World War do not have monuments. There is no memorial to the men who came home unable to sleep, unable to work, unable to tell their families what had happened to them. There is no wall, as in Washington, where the names of the psychologically broken are inscribed in stone. The men who were shot for cowardice, at least 306 British soldiers executed for cowardice or desertion, the majority almost certainly suffering from shell shock, received no official memorial until the Shot at Dawn monument was erected at the National Memorial Arboretum in England in 2001. It took over 80 years. The 306 men represented there were granted a collective pardon by the British government in 2006. The same year, Harry Farr's family received the individual pardon they had been seeking for decades. The pardon was important. It was also, by any honest accounting, grotesquely overdue. What the First World War revealed, and what took the rest of the 20th century to fully absorb, was that the human mind has limits, that those limits can be reached, that when they are reached, the result is not weakness, but injury, and that an institution, a military, a government, a society, that sends men beyond those limits and then punishes them for breaking has committed a moral failure of the most serious kind. The soldiers of the First World War could not have articulated this in those terms. They did not have the language. The language was being invented around them, in the hospitals and in the poetry and in the painful, incomplete medical literature of a war that was generating injuries faster than medicine could name them. But they knew what was happening to them. Wilfred Owen knew. He wrote it down. Siegfried Sassoon knew. He published his statement and dared the army to shoot him. Ivor Gurney knew. He sat in a mental institution for 15 years and kept writing music that nobody played to nobody who listened. And the men who left no record, the ones like Arthur Hubbard writing in diaries hidden in attics. They knew too. They just had nowhere to say it that anyone would hear. Charles Myers, the doctor who first used the term shell shock in The Lancet in 1915, spent the rest of his career trying to improve military psychiatric care. He later said that he regretted inventing the term, that it had caused more harm than good by implying a physical origin for a condition that was far more complex. He was right that the term was imperfect. Every term that has been used since battle fatigue, combat exhaustion, post-traumatic stress disorder is also imperfect. Because the condition itself is not simple. It is what happens when a human being is placed inside an experience that the human mind was not built to survive, and survives anyway. The men of the First World War survived the war. Many of them did not survive the peace. If this video told you something you didn't know about these men, about what they carried, about what we owe them, share it. That's how this channel reaches people who should hear these stories. Until next time, never came home.